find it a great pleasure to come back to Warsaw at this great building, and the acoustics in this room are fantastic. You know, when I give a lot of public speeches, it's very difficult because I have to raise my voice, but now I can whisper and you can hear me speaking. By the way, I love the logo for the IPO Summit because it's a bridge from people who need money to people who have the money. And we are certainly going to be participating in these IPOs, not only in Poland, but in other parts of the world as we go forward. So I really am very happy to see that bridge being built. First of all, I want to tell you something about us in Poland, because we started investing in Poland in February of 1993. If any of you remember what Warsaw was like at that time, you can imagine how I feel now and how the city has changed dramatically and the country has changed so dramatically. I remember, you know, going to a department store and there was nothing in the windows. And things have really changed since then. And it was great. We now have about $6 billion in Eastern Europe total out of the 45 billion of, actually, no, now it's up to 54 billion that we have in emerging markets. And I'm happy to say that we also have selected Poznan as the base for our back office operations for Europe. So we have probably about 400 people now in Poznan working for us in addition to our Warsaw office. So Poland is very important for us. Now, just going into emerging Europe versus the developed Europe situation, I want to define what we mean, in our company at least, as emerging Europe, because on the right you can see all of the countries we include. And I emphasize that we do include Russia in Eastern Europe, and we include places like Turkey and Cyprus in Eastern Europe. So that's a very important point to make. And you can see the other countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, of course, Poland, Ukraine, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and of course, Turkey and Cyprus. If you look at this group of countries, you'll see that because of Russia, the land area is fantastic. Eastern Europe has an incredible potential in land area, and when you see what Poland has done with agriculture, you'll realize that the potential for agricultural growth in the region is going to be very, very good. Population-wise, emerging Europe is a little less than developed Europe, but not that different, pretty much the same. If you look at the situation as regards to the median age, this is very good news because the emerging Europe countries have young populations. The average age is rather young, which is very, very positive as far as I'm concerned, because that's where you have the energetic youth growing these countries. And it shows up, of course, in the numbers. Nominal GDP is low, of course, because we're starting from a low base. And of course, that also means growth is going to be good going forward. If you look at GDP per capita, that is also low compared to the developed Europe. Emerging Europe has got a very low per capita income. But again, as far as we're concerned, that's good news because they're going to be growing that as we go forward. And if you see a per capita growth, the GDP, between 2007 and 2012, in emerging Europe, the growth has been tremendous and is continuing. You can see in that time we've had 28% growth in GDP per capita compared to actually a reduction in the rest of developed Europe. And then if you look at the EM fundamentals, I think it's important to point out, looking at the global emerging markets picture, you'll see that the key word is growth. We are looking at an incredible growth rate in emerging markets all around the world. This year, we're expecting an average of 5.4% growth compared to only 1.1% in the developed countries. The developed countries, of course, United States, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. But this is a big, big difference, and it's going to have tremendous ramifications, not only for Asia, not only for Latin America, not only for Eastern Europe, but all over the world. And the good news is that emerging Europe is outpacing developed Europe in terms of growth. You can see from this chart. Now, a lot of people have been concerned about the debt in Europe. This is a big topic of conversation all over the world. And if you look at the debt, you can see emerging markets actually are reducing their debt to GDP ratio, while the developed countries are increasing the debt to GDP ratios. And if you look at developed Europe versus emerging Europe, the picture is very, very clear. Developed Europe has a much higher debt to GDP compared to the emerging Europe, which again is a very positive thing. When, you know, the rating agencies look at these countries, they look at the debt to GDP ratio in addition to some other factors. Let's look at performance. If you look at performance since 1987, we started, by the way, our very first fund in 1987, the Templeton Emerging Markets Fund, which, by the way, is still listed on the New York Stock Exchange. I just received a letter from our director, who at that time was the director of our company, Templeton, Galbraith, and Hansberger at that time. And he said, you know, Mark, I invested $500,000, $500,000 in your fund in 1987. It's now worth $18 million. And during that time, I've given away about $2 million. This is an argument for long-term investment, because if you put your money in and keep it in for a long time, you can get some very good returns. He also said that at the time, Merrill Lynch, who was underwriting the fund, was trying to raise $100 million. And they came to us and said, look, we can raise $150 million. And I said, sorry, I won't take it. I can only take $100 million. Because in those days, we could only invest in 5 countries. All these other countries were closed. Of course, Poland was closed. All of Eastern Europe was closed. It was Hong Kong, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Mexico. That was it. All the other countries were closed. Now we're investing in over 80 countries around the world, and we have $54 billion to invest. So the growth has been quite amazing. And of course, since '03, you'll see the markets have gone up in emerging markets compared to the world. By the way, another thing we want to get through to people these days is to make sure you dollar cost average. Don't put your money in all at once. Try to spread it out over a little bit, because I have a bad experience. My sister-in-law invested in an emerging markets fund right there. And I had to visit my brother here. And I remember arriving at their home and knocking on the door. I heard her voice behind the door, "Who's there?" I said, "It's Mark." She said, "I'm not opening the door, and give me my money back." I said, "If you open the door, I'll tell you how to get your money back." She opened a little bit, but left a chain on the door. She said, "How?" I said, "Buy more." She slammed the door in my face. So this is the problem. Never give advice to your relatives or friends about the market. But you can see, looking at emerging Europe, actually, over a 10-year period, emerging Europe has outpaced developed Europe and the world index. So over the long term, emerging Europe has done quite well. And if you look at, however, the emerging Europe compared to emerging markets generally, of course, it's done better than developed Europe, but not as well as the rest of emerging markets. And the reason why is that Hungary and Russia have not done as well as Poland, Czech Republic, and Turkey during that period. Of course, all of them were up, but not as good. Now, if you look at a 5-year period, you'll see that emerging markets actually over a 5-year have underperformed developed Europe and the world. And if you look at emerging Europe versus emerging markets and developed Europe, again, emerging Europe has over a 5-year underperformed. And the reason, of course, has been performance in Russia, Czech Republic, Hungary, as well as Poland, and only Turkey was the one that went up during that 5-year period. Now let's look at the 1-year period. You'll see that not too bad. Emerging Europe is coming up and not as bad as it was previously, but still underperforming the world and developed Europe. And if you compare it to the emerging markets generally, actually emerging Europe has done better than emerging markets generally, but not as good as developed Europe. And the reason for that is mainly Czech Republic and Russia, while Turkey, Poland, and Hungary have done quite well. So, how about supply and demand? And here we get into the IPO activity. If you look at supply of emerging markets, new shares, this IPOs, new share issues, secondary issues, etc., you'll see that in 2007 we had an incredible boom in new issues, almost $400 billion in new issues. And then in 2010, right after the subprime crisis, you know, we had a big boom in markets. There was, you know, a lot of euphoria in late 2009 and 2010, and we had new issues of over $450 billion of new money coming into the market to buy new shares. In Europe, however, the situation was very different. And in emerging Europe, 2007 was a great year, about 100 billion in new issues, but 2010 was only about 50 billion, and last year we're talking less than 40 billion. So actually the IPO activity has come down, and we hope that as a result of this conference, we can stimulate more IPO activity. However, if you look at the emerging Europe as a percent of emerging markets new shares, you can see that emerging Europe has taken in 2007 about 27%, in 2010 only 10%, and 2012 16%. So not bad. I mean, emerging Europe is taking an gradually increasing share after having so high amount in 2007. And in Poland, we see here that in 2010, the amount was about 11 billion in new issues coming in. Last year, it was only about 3.5 billion. So we hope that we can move that up as we go forward. And if you look at Poland as a percent of emerging Europe, in 2012, it was only 10%. In 2010, it was 23%. So it's been in a range of anywhere between 5 and 20% of emerging Europe. Now let's look at demand. If we look at the demand for emerging markets equities, you'll see that emerging markets generally have grown dramatically. Back in late 90s, 98, 99, emerging markets, market capitalization of the total world was about 8%. Today, emerging markets represent 35% of the world, the total world market capitalization. This is incredible growth, and it is continuing. However, most pension funds around the world and other investors have no more than 3 to 8% in emerging markets. So most investors are heavily underweight emerging markets. They should have a lot more in emerging markets. However, you're seeing the cumulative flows into emerging markets funds increasing. We've seen that in our own company, and we are seeing more coming in, but it's not nearly enough. And we believe going forward, you're going to get a lot more money coming into not only emerging markets generally, but emerging Europe. And one of the reasons why we are so optimistic is this: valuations. If you look at the valuations of emerging markets generally, the average is about 10 times price-earnings ratio. Partly because we've now started the frontier area, Africa, some parts of Asia, where the markets are very, very unknown and very underpriced. So we're seeing a big difference between emerging markets and the world in terms of valuations. And if we look at emerging Europe, the difference between emerging Europe and developed Europe is very dramatic. The average is about 5 times for emerging Europe and 12 times for developed Europe. And the reason is right here, Russia. Russia is very, very cheap right now. Hungary, Czech Republic, all single digit. Poland is more expensive than others, but then, of course, you've got good growth in Poland, which compensates for the relatively high PE ratio. I just want to close with this slide, which shows you the stock market performance of Poland. And we just did a sort of a straight line projection. And you can see our projection indicates that, of course, to get back to where we were in 06, 07, it'll take a few years, but by 2020, we can see Poland more than almost doubling where they are right now in terms of the pricing of the stock market. So we're very, very optimistic about Poland. And if you want more information about what we're thinking, you can look at us in our blogs and various other Twitters and other internet things. And thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.